The morning of her wedding, Aurora Hale's father sold her. Not metaphorically, not through some twisted legal loophole. He walked into the kitchen where she stood in her dress, the white one she'd saved 3 years to buy, set a crumpled envelope on the table, and told her she belonged to Gerald Finch now. Gerald Finch, who was 64 years old. Gerald Finch, who smelled like motor oil and resentment. Gerald Finch, who had handed her father $40,000 the night before like she was a used truck with decent mileage. Her father didn't even look her in the eye. If someone did that to your daughter, to you, what would you do? Because what happened next, nobody in Culver Creek, Montana ever saw coming. If this story already has your blood boiling, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. Because this story is only getting started. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. PA. The train from Billings to Missoula ran 3 times a week, and Aurora Hale had taken it exactly twice in her 26 years of life. Once when she was 9, for her grandmother's funeral, and once now, coming back from the hospital where Dr. Reyes had sat her down in a beige office and explained in the careful, measured tone that doctors used when they had run out of options that her mother's heart was failing faster than anyone had anticipated. Aurora sat in the second-to-last car, her coat folded across her lap because the heat on that train ran too high and the windows didn't open properly. She had a paper bag of gas station crackers she wasn't eating and a phone with a cracked screen showing a medical bill she couldn't stop looking at, $87,000. The number didn't even feel real. It felt like someone had typed it as a joke. Outside, Montana in November looked the way it always did, enormous and indifferent. Gray sky sitting low over brown hills, a hawk riding something invisible above a frozen creek, beautiful if you weren't breaking apart inside, unbearable if you were. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, a sound. Something between a sharp exhale and a grunt, quiet enough that she almost missed it, coming from the row across the aisle and 2 seats back. She turned on instinct, the way you turn when a child makes a sound in a crowd, and what she saw made her sit up straight. A man, mid-30s maybe, dark suit that was very expensive and very ruined. There was blood soaking through the left side, dark and spreading, the kind of stain that doesn't come from a scratch. He was sitting completely upright, jaw set, staring straight ahead, and if she hadn't heard that sound, she might have thought he was sleeping. He was working very hard at looking like nothing was wrong. He was also absolutely alone in a section of 4 seats, which felt strange for a Thursday afternoon train. Aurora sat there for a moment. The reasonable thing, the safe thing, was to look away. She had enough trouble. She had $87,000 worth of trouble. She had a sick mother and a gas station bag of crackers, and she did not need to involve herself in whatever this was. She picked up her coat, walked across the aisle, and sat down in the seat next to him. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark, almost black, the kind that didn't give much away. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had dried. His expression said, very clearly, "Don't." "I'm not going to ask," Aurora said. She kept her voice low. "I'm just going to look." He said nothing. She pulled aside his jacket carefully. He let her, which surprised her, and saw what she already suspected. The wound was deep. He had pressed a folded cloth against it, already soaked through. He'd been sitting there bleeding quietly for God knows how long. "Do you have anything in that bag?" she asked. "No." "That's not great." She thought for a second, then went back to her seat and came back with her scarf. Cashmere, the only nice thing she owned, a birthday gift from her mother, and folded it into a compress. "This is going to hurt." "I know." It did. He didn't make a sound, but his hand gripped the armrest hard enough that his knuckles went white. Aurora pressed and held. She could feel his breathing change, controlled, deliberate, the kind of breathing you learn when pain is something you've had to manage before. "You should get off at the next stop," she said. "There's a clinic in—" "I won't be getting off at the next stop." "Then you should tell someone." "I'm telling you not to tell anyone." She looked up at him. Up close, the face was harder than she'd first registered. Not cruel exactly, but the kind of face that had made a lot of decisions and not always soft ones. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not gratitude, not suspicion, something more careful than both. "Fine," she said. But you're losing too much blood. I need to tie this. She used her phone charger cord. It was all she had to secure the compress. It was absurd, and it probably wasn't going to hold, but it was better than nothing. He watched her work without speaking. When she was done, she sat back and stared at the seat in front of her. "Thank you," he said finally. The words came out like he'd had to locate them somewhere. "Don't thank me yet. You still look terrible." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but almost. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, which was its own kind of answer. "Aurora," she said. He nodded, like he was filing it away somewhere. "You live in Missoula?" "Culver Creek, about 40 minutes out." He didn't offer his own name. She didn't ask. There was something about the way he carried silence, like it was a deliberate choice and not a failure, that made her feel like asking would be the wrong move. She'd helped a stranger on a train. That was all this was. That was all it needed to be. She went back to her seat and stared at her phone bill for the rest of the ride. She didn't think about him again until 4 days later, when the convoy of black SUVs came down the dirt road toward her family's farm. Culver Creek was the kind of small town that ran entirely on other people's business. By the time Aurora drove back from the grocery store that Tuesday morning, her mother needed specific crackers, the low-sodium kind, and the shop only got them on Tuesdays. There were already 3 people standing at the end of Mrs. Calloway's driveway staring at something down the road. Aurora pulled over and followed their line of sight. There were 8 vehicles. Maybe 10. Black, all of them, moving slowly like they weren't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. They turned off the county road onto the Hale property like they already knew where it was, which meant someone had told them, which meant Aurora's stomach dropped before she even understood why. She drove back fast, faster than she should have on that road, and pulled up to the farmhouse just as the first vehicles were stopping. What happened next would stay with her for years, the way certain moments do. Not because they were good, but because they were too strange and too large to fully absorb. A man stepped out of the center vehicle. It was him. The man from the train. Only now he was in a clean suit, black, perfectly pressed, and standing in the November mud of her family's front yard like he owned all of it. Behind him, people were getting out of every vehicle. Men in dark coats, some with weapons visible, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who did this regularly. There were neighbors gathering at the fence line already. She could hear Mrs. Calloway on her phone. Aurora got out of her car. She walked straight up to him because she didn't know what else to do, and when she was close enough, she said, "What is this?" "I wanted to thank you properly," Lucien Moretti said. "This is not proper," she said. "This is insane. Who are you?" He told her. The name landed on the crowd like a stone in water. She could feel the ripple of it even through her own shock. People at the fence going still, someone making a sound that was almost a gasp. Lucien Moretti. Even in Culver Creek, Montana, the name meant something. It meant the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. "I want to speak with your father," Lucien said. "My father's not... He's inside, I know." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Her father, as it turned out, was already on the porch. George Hale was a big man gone soft, with the particular shame of someone who knew exactly what he looked like. He came down the steps with his hat in his hand, and Aurora watched him shake Lucien Moretti's hand with a deference that made her skin crawl. The two of them talked for several minutes, too quietly for her to hear. Whatever her father heard, it changed his face. He went from nervous to something that looked almost like calculation. It was only later that she understood why. In front of roughly 60 peoples, neighbors, farmhands, 3 members of the local sheriff's office who had shown up and were standing very still at a respectful distance, Lucien Moretti turned to Aurora and said calmly, with the same ease he might use ordering coffee, that she was the woman he intended to marry. The silence that followed was so complete that Aurora could hear the wind moving through the dead corn at the edge of the property. Then she walked up and slapped him across the face. It was not a small slap. It was the kind that comes from the shoulder, from somewhere that had been building pressure for a long time, and it snapped his head sideways and left a mark she could see from where she was standing. 2 of his men moved forward immediately and stopped when he raised one hand. "I have a fiancé," Aurora said. Her voice was shaking, but she held it. His name is Ryan. I am getting married in 6 weeks. I don't know who you are or what you think gives you the right to come to my home and say something like that, but you need to take your cars and your people and leave. Lucian turned his head back slowly. The mark on his cheek was visible. His expression was completely even. I know about Ryan, he said. Then you know I'm taken. I know what I know. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that same careful expression she remembered from the train, like he was seeing something she wasn't. I've spent my whole life taking what I wanted, he said. Cities, companies, territory. I never asked. I never had to. He paused. You're the first thing I've wanted that I'm going to have to earn. You don't get to want me, Aurora said. I'm not a thing. No, he said. You're not. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned, got back into his vehicle, and the entire convoy pulled away with the same unhurried certainty with which it had arrived. The town talked about nothing else for a week. Ryan Castillo had been Aurora's anchor since she was 7 years old. That was the word she would have used, anchor. Not in the romantic way people said it in movies. More literally, like a physical object she'd been tethered to long enough that she couldn't imagine drifting without it. He was steady, reliable. He had sandy hair that never did what he wanted and a laugh that came easily, and he'd held her hand at her grandmother's funeral, and later at every hospital appointment, and later still on the steps of the medical center in Billings when the news about her mother's heart came through. She told herself that was love. She told herself it was enough. Ryan heard about Lucian's visit. Everyone heard it was Culver Creek, and he came over that night with the tight expression he wore when he was controlling something stronger underneath. You're not taking this seriously enough, he said. I'm taking it seriously, Aurora said. I told him to leave. That's not... Aurora, do you know who he is? I looked him up. Then you know... I know what I read online, Ryan, which is a lot of things that may or may not be true. He set down his glass. People like that don't just show up. They want something. He's not here because he stopped, made himself lower his voice. He's not here for the reasons he said. She didn't know what to say to that because part of her agreed with him. She didn't understand Lucien Moretti's reasons. She didn't understand any of this. What I know, she said carefully, is that I handled it. He left. He'll come back. Then I'll handle it again. Ryan nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. He looked, Aurora realized, afraid. Not concerned, not protective. Afraid. She filed that away without knowing why and didn't sleep well that night. Her mother was awake when Aurora brought her evening medication, which wasn't unusual. Margaret Hale had reached the stage of her illness where sleep was thin and unreliable. She sat propped up in the bed she'd slept in for 30 years and watched Aurora with the sharp eyes that the disease hadn't touched yet. You're upset about something, Margaret said. I'm fine. You always say that when you're not. Aurora sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her mother's hands, small now and very still. She told her about the train, about Lucien, about what he'd said in the yard. Margaret was quiet for a long time. What was he like? She asked finally. On the train. Quiet, controlled. Aurora thought about it. He didn't ask for help. He just let me help him. That's different from someone who doesn't need anyone, Margaret said. I don't know what it means. Maybe you don't need to know yet. Her mother squeezed her hand. But I know that look on your face, baby. That's not the face of someone who's completely forgotten a person. Mom, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying what I see. Aurora drove to Ryan's the next morning to talk properly, to lay everything out clearly, to be honest about the strangeness of the last week. She was going to tell him about the feeling she couldn't name. She was going to ask him to help her understand it. She pulled up to his house and saw her father's truck parked out front. She sat in the car for a moment, thinking. Her father almost never came to Ryan's. They weren't close, exactly. Her father wasn't close to anyone since the drinking got bad. And this was early for him to be anywhere. She got out and walked up to the side window because the front door was solid and you could see into the kitchen from the side. She saw her father pass an envelope across the table to Ryan. Ryan opened it and fanned the bills inside with his thumb the way you do when you're checking, not when you're surprised. He wasn't surprised. She stood there in the cold for a long moment, not understanding, and then understanding completely in a way that made her feel like the ground had shifted underneath her. She walked back to her car and drove home and sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing until the feeling solidified into something she could hold. Her father owed money to people. She had known this, vaguely, the way you know things in a family that doesn't talk about them. The gambling was not a secret, exactly. It was a silence everyone maintained. She had assumed it was manageable. She had assumed, the way you do when you love someone despite everything, that he was handling it. She had been wrong about a lot of things lately. The phone call came that evening. Not from her father, from a man she didn't know, who introduced himself as an associate of Gerald Finch's, and informed her, with the practiced calm of someone who did this professionally, that arrangements had been made. That Mr. Finch was generous and forward-thinking, and that the wedding date would need to be moved to accommodate his schedule. The wedding. Her wedding. "I think you have the wrong number," she said. "Miss Hale," the man said. "We really don't." She hung up. She called her father. He didn't answer. She drove to the farm's barn, where he spent his evenings, and found him not drunk, which was worse. Found him sober and sitting on a feed bucket and unable to look at her, which told her everything the phone call hadn't. "How much?" she said. He said a number. She said, "So you sold me." He didn't answer, which was the same as yes. Aurora walked back to the house. She went to her room. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed, knees up, and let herself feel the full weight of it. The bills she couldn't pay, the fiancé who had taken money, the father who had made a deal with a man old enough to be his own father, the mother dying quietly down the hall. She sat there for a long time. Then she stood up, washed her face, and started making plans. Because Aurora Hale had been handling things alone for a long time, she was not going to stop now. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday. Gerald Finch had chosen the community church in town, the biggest one, because he wanted witnesses, Aurora would later understand. He wanted public. He wanted it done in a place where there was no easy way to make a scene without consequence. She wore the white dress, not because she wanted to, because she had bought it with 3 years of Sunday overtime at the diner, and she wasn't going to let it mean nothing. The church was half full. People she'd known her whole life sat in those pews, some confused, some uncomfortable, some with the particular expression of people who had heard rumors but convinced themselves it wasn't their business. Gerald Finch sat at the front in a gray suit that fit him badly. He had the satisfied look of a man completing a transaction. Ryan was there, standing off to the side near the vestibule, not as the groom, not in any formal role, just there, watching. He met her eyes when she came in and then looked away, and she understood with absolute cold clarity that he had known about this, had known for longer than one conversation. The minister began speaking. Aurora stood at the front of the church in her own dress and watched Gerald Finch walk toward her and thought, very clearly, "I am not doing this." She didn't know what the alternative was. She didn't have a plan. She had a feeling, the same feeling she'd had on the train when she'd walked across the aisle without knowing why. Some instinct that said, move before the mind could argue. The church doors opened. Not gently, both of them, at once, with a sound like a thunderclap that made everyone in the pews flinch sideways. The November light came through in a cold, gray rectangle, and in it stood Lucien Moretti. He walked down the aisle at the same pace he did everything, unhurried, certain, like disrupting a wedding in front of 60 people was simply another Tuesday. His men filled the doorway behind him and fanned out along the walls. She could see more vehicles through the open doors, surrounding the building on 3 sides. Gerald Finch turned around. Whatever he saw in Lucien's face made him go still. Lucien stopped about 6 feet from the altar. He looked at Aurora, just at her for a moment, as though assessing something, and then turned his attention to Finch. "Touch her," Lucien said. His voice was level and completely quiet and carried to every corner of that church. "Touch anything that belongs to her. Touch her mother. Touch her property." He paused. "None of you will leave here." The silence that followed was the most complete silence Aurora had ever been inside. Gerald Finch's face was doing something complicated. He was a man who had spent 60 years getting what he paid for, and he was looking at the first thing he'd paid for that had someone standing between them who frightened him. He stepped back. It was a small movement, less than a foot. But the whole church saw it, and in Culver Creek, Montana, that was the end of Gerald Finch. Lucian turned back to Aurora. "Let's go," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, at the absolute lack of triumph in his expression, like this had been an errand rather than a rescue. She thought about the money on the table, Ryan's hand fanning the bills, her father on the feed bucket, unable to look at her, the number the doctor had said in the beige office in Billings. She thought about a man sitting bleeding on a train, working very hard at looking like nothing was wrong. She picked up her small bag from the front pew, stepped past Gerald Finch without looking at him, and walked toward the door. Lucy Ian fell in beside her without a word. Behind them, the church stayed very still and very quiet, and outside the Montana sky was the same enormous gray it had been every day of her life. And Aurora Hale walked out of the worst morning of her life into something she could not yet name and was not at all sure she was ready for. But she was walking, and that, she had learned, was always where things actually began. Part 2 của kịch bản này được triển khai với dung lượng mục tiêu 4.000 đến 4.500 từ, bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 1, yêu cầu tập trung hoàn toàn vào cấu trúc mâu thuẫn leo thang, các mâu thuẫn nội bộ giữa các nhân vật phải bùng nổ, sự nghi ngờ tăng cao và những sai lầm trong quá khứ bắt đầu để lại hậu quả. Duy trì giống văn Mỹ thô ráp, giàu cảm xúc, không sáo rộng. Hãy kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tập trung vào những phản ứng bản năng nhất của con người, hơi thở dồn dập, những cái nhìn đầy sát khí và sự mệt mỏi rêu rã. Hội thoại phải chiếm ưu thế, mang tính đối đầu gay gắt, gãy gọn, không triết lý suông, triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene. Tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Kết thúc phần này bằng một nút thất kịch tính, the point of no return, khiến nhân vật không còn đường lui. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết từng hành động nhỏ. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi trước khi đủ dung lượng, hãy dừng lại ở một câu rạng rỡ để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp. Chỉ dẫn bắt buộc. Đây là một câu chuyện, điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu, hãy viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more. The first thing Aurora noticed about Lucien Moretti's car was that it was completely silent inside. Not the silence of something broken, the silence of something engineered. The kind of quiet that costs more money than she'd made in her entire life, where the engine and the road and the world outside all got muffled down to almost nothing, and what was left was just the two of them and the space between them, which felt enormous. She was still in her wedding dress. She became aware of this about 4 minutes into the drive when she looked down at the white fabric pooled around her legs and felt something lurch in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief and was mostly just the particular shock of a person who has survived something and hasn't processed it yet. Her hands were in her lap. They weren't shaking. She was a little surprised by that. Lucien sat on the other side of the back seat, his focus on his phone, reading something. He hadn't looked at her since they'd gotten in. 2 of his men were in the front, the driver and a man who hadn't been introduced and whose name she didn't know, who sat with the particular stillness of someone paid to be invisible. "Where are we going?" Aurora asked. "Somewhere safe," Lucien said without looking up. That's not an answer. He looked up then. His expression was even, like she'd asked something reasonable that deserved a reasonable response, and not like she'd just been pulled out of her own forced wedding 40 minutes ago. "My property," he said. "Outside of Billings. It's about 2 hours." "I didn't agree to go to your property." You got in the car." "I got in the car because the alternative was Gerald Finch." "I know." She stared at him. "So you're not going to pretend this is something it isn't?" "No." "Then what is it?" He put his phone down and looked at her properly for the first time. "Right now, it's a car ride. That's all." "And after the car ride?" "You'll have your own room. Your mother will be brought from the farm tonight. There's a medical team already arranged. Her equipment will be transferred. Your things will follow tomorrow morning." Aurora felt the breath go out of her. You already arranged that. Yes, without asking me. I was operating on the assumption that you would choose leaving over staying. That's not... She stopped. You don't get to make decisions about my mother without talking to me first. That's not something I'll accept. Not now, not ever. She is not a piece of furniture you move because it's convenient. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, more like recalibration. You're right, he said. I should have asked. She hadn't expected that. It threw her, the directness of it. No deflection, no explanation, just acknowledgement. She turned back to the window and said nothing for a while. Fields, highway, a sky that had decided to go from gray to something darker in the last hour. Did you know? She asked. About my father and Ryan? Did you know before you came to the farm the first time? Silence for a moment. I knew some of it, Lucien said. How much is some? I knew your father had debts. I knew Ryan had reasons for the engagement that weren't what they appeared to be. The air in the car changed temperature. And you didn't tell me, she said. No. Why? He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same careful expression, the one she remembered from the train, the one that felt like being read in a language you didn't speak. Because you wouldn't have believed me, he said finally. You loved him, or you believed you did. If I'd come to you with that information first, before you knew who I was, before you had any reason to trust me, you'd have assumed I was lying, that I was trying to remove an obstacle. You were trying to remove an obstacle. Yes, but I wasn't lying. She turned back to the window. The truth of it sat in her chest like a splinter, too small to remove cleanly, too sharp to ignore. I hate that you're right about that, she said very quietly. He didn't say anything, which was somehow the correct response. The estate was not what she'd pictured. She had imagined something from a movie. Marble floors, gold fixtures, the kind of excess that announced itself from the gate. What she found instead was a house that was large but not obscene, set into a hillside with a view of the valley below, built from stone and dark wood with the deliberate restraint of someone who'd had money long enough that they didn't need to prove it anymore. There were no gates shaped like initials. There were no fountains. There was a security detail that was very present and very quiet, and a woman named Vera, who met them at the door and who had the manner of someone who had managed difficult situations for a very long time and found them mildly interesting. Vera showed Aurora to a room on the second floor. It was clean, warm, and contained nothing that felt like a cell. Wide windows overlooking the valley, a bed that looked like an apology for every bad night she'd spent at the farm, a bathroom with hot water that actually ran at pressure. Aurora stood in the middle of it in her wedding dress and felt, for the first time all day, like she might cry. She didn't. She changed into the clothes Vera brought, jeans, a sweater, things that fit her because someone had paid attention and she didn't want to think about that, and went downstairs looking for the thing she actually needed, which was information. Lucien was in what she assumed was an office, standing at a window with a glass of something dark that he wasn't drinking. He heard her come in and didn't turn around. When does my mother arrive? Aurora asked. 3 hours, maybe 4. I want to be there when she comes in. I want to be the one who explains where we are. Of course. She folded her arms. Stop agreeing with everything I say. It's making me nervous. He turned around then, and for the first time she saw something that might have been amusement move across his face. Brief, quickly contained. What would you prefer? I prefer you to be what I expected, which was someone easier to be angry at. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set the glass down and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit down. I'll tell you what you actually need to know. She sat. He remained standing, which she recognized as a choice and didn't comment on. Your father owes $460,000, Lucien said, accumulated over 11 years. 3 different creditors, one of whom is connected to Finch directly. The arrangement he made was debt forgiveness in exchange for the marriage. Aurora's jaw tightened. He sold me for less than $500,000. The debt isn't the point. The point is that Finch wanted something your father had, and your father didn't have the spine to say no. And Ryan? Lucien's expression flattened slightly. Ryan Castillo has known about Finch's interest for approximately 4 months. He received 2 payments, the one you saw and one prior. In exchange, he was to maintain the engagement long enough to keep you from making other arrangements and then step aside when the time came. The room felt very quiet. He was keeping me occupied, Aurora said. Yes. So the engagement was never... No. She sat with that for a moment. It wasn't the shock it should have been. She'd already known it, on some level, from the moment she'd seen her father's truck outside Ryan's house. But there's a difference between suspecting a thing and having it stated plainly, and the plainness of it landed somewhere low and solid. "Who are you?" she said. "Not the name, not what's written about you online. Who are you?" Lucien was quiet for a long beat. "I'm someone who grew up learning that the only reliable thing in the world is leverage," he said. "I built something with that. I'm not going to pretend it was built cleanly." "Are you dangerous?" "Yes." "To me?" He held her gaze. "No." "How am I supposed to believe that?" "You're not," he said. "Not yet. Belief takes time. I'm aware of that." She stood up. "My mother better be here in 3 hours." "She will be." She walked to the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. "The man who saved me when I was a child," she said, without turning around. "During Christmas. When I was 7, someone stopped a man who tried to grab me at the bus station in Billings. My mother always told me it was a stranger. She didn't know his name." The silence behind her stretched just a fraction too long. "Good night, Aurora," Lucien said. She left without pushing it. But she lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling of a room that wasn't hers, listening to the quiet of a house full of armed men, thinking about what a fraction of a second too long actually meant. Margaret Hale arrived at 11:40 that night in a medical transport vehicle, accompanied by a nurse named Sandra, who had clearly been given very specific instructions and was following them with professional precision. Aurora was in the driveway before the vehicle stopped, and she held her mother's hand through the whole process of getting her settled. New room, same equipment, same medication schedule, nothing changed except the walls. Margaret looked around the room with her sharp eyes and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "This is a very expensive room, baby." "I know." "Tell me what happened today." So Aurora told her. All of it. Finch, Ryan, the church, the car, the conversation in the office. She kept her voice level, and Margaret listened without interrupting, which was how her mother had always listened, like she was collecting pieces and would assemble them in her own time. When Aurora finished, Margaret was quiet for almost a minute. "You trust him," her mother said. "I don't know him." "That's not what I said." Aurora looked at the wall. "I don't not trust him," which is probably insane given everything. "Or it's accurate," Margaret said. "Sometimes the clearest read you get on a person is before you know enough to talk yourself out of it." She reached for Aurora's hand. "What are you afraid of?" "That this is still a transaction," Aurora said. "That the only difference between him and Finch is that Lucien's version of owning something is more expensive." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Then watch. Don't decide. Just watch what he does when you don't give him what he wants." The first real confrontation happened 3 days later. Aurora had settled into a rhythm of controlled unease. She moved through the house without asking permission, ate when she chose, spent mornings with her mother, spent afternoons walking the grounds in the cold with the kind of restless energy that had nowhere to go. Lucien was present the way furniture was present. There, occupying space, not demanding attention, but impossible to forget. They had meals together sometimes. It wasn't planned. It was the result of a large house with one kitchen and 2 people who woke up at similar hours. And the first few times it happened, they both pretended it hadn't. On the 4th morning, Lucien set a cup of coffee on the counter near her without asking if she wanted it, and she said, "I want to go into town." He didn't look up from the papers he was reading. "Okay." "Alone?" He looked up. "Just to the pharmacy," she said. "My mother needs a specific prescription that wasn't in the transfer. I want to go get it myself." "I'll have someone..." I said alone, Lucien. The name came out before she'd planned it. First time she'd used it directly. She watched something register in his face. Brief, quickly gone. It's not about the errand, he said carefully. No. It's about the fact that I have not been outside this property in 4 days, and I need to walk through a door that doesn't have 3 people standing behind it. She held his gaze. I'm not running. I have nowhere to run to. I'm asking to go get a prescription and come back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Marcus will follow at a distance. You won't see him unless something happens. Fine. Aurora. She stopped. If anyone approaches you, anyone who looks like they're asking more than a casual question, you call this number. He slid a card across the counter. What kind of anyone? The kind with an interest in my business. She took the card. You have enemies. Everyone in my position has enemies. How many? He picked his papers back up. Enough that we have this conversation. She went into town. She got the prescription. She walked the main street of a town she didn't know for 22 minutes before a man in a gray jacket fell into step beside her with the practiced casualness of someone who'd been waiting and said, very quietly, Miss Hale, we'd like to talk to you about Lucien Moretti, privately. Her hand was in her coat pocket and on the card before she'd finished processing the sentence. She called the number, said 2 words, kept walking. Marcus materialized from a doorway she hadn't noticed, and the man in the gray jacket looked at him and made a decision very quickly, turning the other direction and moving with the careful speed of someone trying not to look like they were fleeing. Aurora stood on the sidewalk with her heart hammering and her face completely still, and waited for her hands to stop shaking before she got back in the car. She didn't tell Lucien right away. She sat with it for an hour, turning it over, because she needed to understand what it meant before she had a conversation about it. What it meant, she concluded, was that the world outside this house had already decided she was attached to Lucien Moretti, and people who wanted leverage over him were going to view her accordingly, which meant the choice she thought she was making, stay temporarily, maintain distance, keep an exit available, wasn't actually the choice in front of her anymore. She found him in the office and told him what had happened. His expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. What did he look like? Lucien said. She described him. Lucien looked at his phone, sent a message, put it back down. You didn't call immediately, he said. I was processing. Next time, I know, she said. I know. Lucien, what's actually happening? Not the version where you give me enough to not be afraid, the real one. He looked at her for a long moment. There are people who believe that because I stepped away from certain territories, they have an opportunity, he said. Some of them have been watching to understand what matters to me, to find a pressure point. And I'm the pressure point. You became one when I came to the church. The weight of that settled on her. So by accepting your help, I made myself a target. Yes. And by refusing your help, I would have ended up married to Finch. Yes. So there was never a version of this where I was safe. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I need you to understand something, Aurora said. I am not angry at you for the situation. I am telling you that I'm going to need the truth, all of it, not the edited version. If you want me to make decisions that don't get both of us killed. I grew up handling things alone. I'm good at it. But I can't handle things I don't know about. Lucien studied her face. Okay, he said. Okay meaning you agree, or okay meaning you'll think about it? Okay meaning I agree. She nodded. She turned to leave. Aurora. She looked back. The man from the bus station, he said. Billings, December, you were 7. She went very still. It was me, he said. The silence between them stretched long enough that she could hear the wind outside, cold and very far away. She didn't say anything. She didn't know what there was to say to that, to the information that the person she'd spent a week trying to categorize as a stranger had been present at the exact moment that had scared her more than anything in her childhood, that had woken her up in cold sweats until she was 12. She didn't know what it meant that he'd known this and hadn't said so immediately. She turned and walked out of the office without a word. He let her go. She walked to her mother's room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Margaret looked at her daughter's face and didn't ask any questions, just shifted over to make room. And they sat together in the quiet of a room in a house that belonged to a man neither of them had known 3 weeks ago, while somewhere below them, in an office, Lucien Moretti did not come after her, which was, she was slowly learning, its own form of language. The escape attempt happened on a Thursday. She had not planned it with any great sophistication. That was the honest truth. She had lain awake the night before listening to the sounds of the house, the shift changes, the patrol rhythms, the way the east wing went quieter after 2 in the morning. And by 4, she had a shape in her mind that was less a plan and more a direction. She didn't want to leave permanently. She had accepted, somewhere in the previous week, that permanently was no longer a meaningful concept. She wanted to prove to herself that she could, that the door wasn't locked, that she was a person making a choice to remain, and not a person who had simply exchanged one captor for a more comfortable one. She took the keys to the smaller vehicle from the hook in the utility room, which she'd identified 5 days ago. She drove out the service exit, which sat between 2 shifts. She made it 40 minutes down the mountain road before she heard the engines behind her. 2 vehicles. Coming fast, closing the gap with the particular efficiency of people who'd anticipated exactly this. She considered pulling over and didn't. She pressed the accelerator instead, because the choice she'd made at 4 in the morning was still the choice she wanted. Even now, even with her hands gripping the wheel too hard and the road ahead too dark and too narrow. She made it another 6 minutes before the lead vehicle pulled alongside her and matched her speed. Lucien was in the passenger seat. Not a bodyguard. Not Marcus. Lucien watching her through the glass with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not anger, not cold calculation. Something that looked almost like fear, which made no sense and which she couldn't stop thinking about even as she realized that the road ahead was going to bend into a switchback, and she didn't know this mountain, and he did. She slowed. Not because she was told to, because the options had run out. She pulled to the shoulder and sat with her hands on the wheel and her forehead nearly touching it, breathing through her nose, while outside the temperature was somewhere below freezing and the wind off the mountain was the kind that meant business. His door opened. She heard it. She got out first. She went to the trunk because there was a basic emergency kit and she'd registered it on the way out. She'd registered it because that's the kind of thing she registered. And she pulled out the tire iron, not because she'd decided to, not with any thought behind it, but because the thing inside her that had been building pressure for weeks needed to go somewhere, and this was the shape it took. She swung it toward him. He moved. Fast. Much faster than she'd expected, stepping back and to the side so the iron hit nothing but air. She swung again. He blocked it with his forearm. She felt the impact travel up the iron and into her hands, and caught her wrist, and she brought her knee up hard into his ribs before he could adjust, and he stumbled back 2 steps, one hand going to his side. His men were behind him, with weapons half raised. Lucien threw one hand up without looking at them. Aurora punched him across the jaw. She had never punched anyone in her life. It hurt her hand considerably more than she'd anticipated, and the sound was not the clean cinematic crack of television, but something meaty and wrong, and blood appeared at the corner of his mouth and ran down his chin. He did not hit her back. He straightened up. He looked at her through the rain. Because it was raining now, she was soaked through. She hadn't even noticed. And his jaw was bleeding and his eyes were very dark and his hands were at his sides. "If you want to break something," he said, "break something." She threw the tire iron at his chest. He caught it. She shoved him in the chest with both hands, and the rain was running into her eyes, and she said, "If you loved me, if any of this was what you said it was, you would let me go. You would step aside. You would stop." Her voice cracked. She pressed through it. "You would stop making me choose between bad options and worse ones." He stood in the rain and bled and said nothing. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me why I should stay. Not because I owe you, not because it's safer. Tell me one reason that isn't about what you want." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because you're the first person in 20 years who helped me without being asked and without wanting anything for it," he said. "And I don't know what to do with that except try to be worth it." The rain came down. Aurora stood in it, soaked and shaking and furious and exhausted, and felt something in her chest move. Not soften, not surrender, but shift. The way ice shifts in late winter when you don't yet know it's going to break, but you can hear it changing. She dropped to her knees, not from weakness. Her legs simply made a decision before she did. She sat in the wet gravel on the side of a mountain road and put her face in her hands. Lucien crouched in front of her, close enough that she could see the blood on his chin still running thin in the rain. He didn't touch her. He just waited. That was when his phone rang. He looked at it. His face changed in a way she hadn't seen before. Something sharp and cold replacing everything else. He stood up. He said something into the phone in Italian, short and low. He ended the call. "What?" Aurora said. Lucien looked down at her with an expression that told her, before the words, that the thing that had been approaching from the distance had arrived. "Your mother," he said. "She's gone." Aurora felt the world stop rotating. Gone? Not, she's alive. He said it fast, and she could tell he registered how badly the first word had landed. She's not at the estate. Aurora. Someone took her. The gravel was still wet under her knees when Aurora stood up. She didn't think about standing. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up, the same way it had on the train, the same way it had in the church. Some animal part of her that understood that there was no time for the floor, no time for falling apart, no time for anything except moving. "How long?" she said. Lucien was already on a second call. He held up one finger. "Wait." And she wanted to break it off, but she stood still and breathed through her nose and counted the seconds. He ended the call. "Sandra, the night nurse, was found in your mother's room approximately 40 minutes ago. She was sedated. Someone used the service entrance on the north side, which was on the camera rotation gap between 2:15 and 2:30. "While I was gone," Aurora said. "Yes." She stared at him. "While you were chasing me." Something moved through his expression. He didn't look away from it. "Yes." The rain between them felt very loud suddenly. "They knew," she said. "They knew you'd come after me. They counted on it. Someone told them about the camera gap. Someone told them about the shift schedule. Lucien, this came from inside." She watched him absorb that. His jaw tightened once, briefly, the way you'd see a structural beam flex under weight. "Get in the car," he said. "Don't tell me to get in the car." "Aurora." His voice dropped to something very flat and very quiet. "I will find your mother. I will not stop until I do. But I need you inside a vehicle right now because standing on this road makes you visible, and visible is the last thing either of us should be in the next 10 minutes. She got in the car. The drive back was 22 minutes. Nobody spoke. Lucien was on his phone for 19 of those minutes, speaking in low bursts, Italian, English, something else she didn't recognize. His voice carrying the particular texture of a man who is very angry and expressing it entirely through precision. No raised volume, no cursing. Just that flat clinical directness that was somehow more frightening than shouting. Aurora sat and watched his face and profile and tried to inventory what she actually knew. Her mother had been taken during a window of approximately 15 minutes. The window had been created by her escape attempt. The escape attempt had been spontaneous. She hadn't told anyone, hadn't planned it in advance, which meant whoever had done this hadn't relied on advanced knowledge of her specific actions. They had relied on the predictable reaction of a man who would immediately chase the woman he'd declared publicly, in front of 60 witnesses, that he intended to marry, which meant they knew Lucien, which meant this was not opportunistic. She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and thought about her mother's face, the sharp eyes, the thin hands, the way Margaret Hale had spent 30 years being stronger than the circumstances she'd been handed, and was still doing it now from a hospital bed. If anyone hurt her mother, Aurora would not need Lucien Moretti's help to handle it. That thought surprised her with its clarity. The estate looked different when they returned. The lights were all on. Men moved with the visible urgency that had been invisible before. The careful stillness replaced by something operational and grim. Vera met them at the door with an expression that had shed its professional composure somewhere in the last hour. "The north camera," Lucien said, before Vera could speak. "Deliberately cut, not malfunctioned," Vera said. and the sedative used on Sandra was administered by injection, not food or drink. Someone got close to her without triggering a response, which means she knew them, Aurora said. Both of them looked at her. Sandra wouldn't let a stranger close enough to inject something. She's careful. I watched her work for 4 days. She checks everything, locks the medication cabinet, even when she's standing 2 feet from it. Aurora met Vera's eyes. Someone she recognized walked into that room, and she didn't raise an alarm because she didn't see them as a threat. Vera looked at Lucien. Pull every personnel file, he said. Everyone with access to that floor. I want to know who had contact with the outside in the last 2 weeks. Every call, every message, every visitor. And Sandra herself? Vera asked. Her too. Aurora said, she's not involved. I'm not assuming she is. I'm being thorough. There's a difference between thorough and wasting time on someone who was literally drugged unconscious. Lucien looked at her steadily. Yes, there is, and I'll determine which this is after I have the information. She bit back what she'd been about to say and nodded once, tightly. They found the inside source in 40 minutes. Not through surveillance analysis, not through phone records. Through the oldest method available, which was that when Lucien assembled the full household staff in the main hall and stood in front of them and said very quietly that he was going to find out what happened regardless, and that the difference between what happened next would depend entirely on whether the information came from him or came from someone in this room. A man named Colton, who had worked the North Wing for 8 months and had the look of someone who had been deciding something for the last hour, took a breath and stepped forward. Aurora watched it happen from the doorway. Colton was 26 or 27. Not the face of a villain, the face of a person who had gotten into something too deep and too fast and was now standing in front of the consequences of it with the particular gray look of someone who understood they were out of options. He'd been contacted 4 months ago, offered more money than he made in a year. All he'd had to do was report patrol patterns, camera rotations, staff schedules. He told himself it was just information. He told himself nobody would get hurt. He said all of this in the flat, rote tone of a person reciting a confession they've been rehearsing in their head for hours. His hands shook slightly at his sides, and he kept them very still. Who contacted you? Lucien said. Not a question, a direction. A man named Garrett. I don't have a last name. I have a number. Give it to Marcus. Colton did. He didn't resist when 2 of Lucien's men stepped forward. He just looked old for his age, and Aurora looked away because the expression on his face was one she recognized. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision for money that had turned out to cost considerably more than money. And she did not have space for sympathy right now, but she noted it anyway, filed it somewhere to feel later when her mother was back. Lucien turned to her. The number will tell us where they're operating from. Give me 2 hours. I'm coming with you. No. Lucien, Aurora. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps, which felt fast for someone who always moved like he had unlimited time. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes. I need you here. Not because I'm protecting you. Because if they call with terms, with demands, with anything, I need someone here who can make a decision immediately. Vera doesn't have the standing. You do. She stared at him. You're giving me authority. I'm telling you that you're the one person whose judgment about your mother I trust completely. Yes. She absorbed that. The honesty of it was disarming in a way she'd stopped expecting from him. 2 hours, she said. 2 hours. If it's longer than 2 hours, I'm going to do something you won't like. The almost smile moved across his face and was gone. I know, he said. He left. Aurora sat down in the main hall because her legs had decided they'd been cooperative long enough, and Vera brought coffee without asking, and the estate settled into the particular loaded silence of a house waiting for news. The call came at 47 minutes, not to Lucien's phone, to hers. She stared at the number, unknown, Montana area code, and picked up on the second ring. Aurora Hale. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the deliberate calm of someone who had scripted this. I imagine you've been waiting. Where is my mother? She's comfortable. Medicated, resting. The equipment transferred without difficulty, which I think shows a level of care you ought to appreciate. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm hard and kept her voice flat. What do you want? Simple. You leave. Tonight. Without Moretti, without his people, without telling him where you're going. You disappear and your mother comes home in the morning. And if I don't? Silence for 3 seconds. Miss Hale, your mother is 71 years old and in cardiac failure. The equipment keeping her stable runs on power that we control. I think we both understand what the word if costs in this situation. Aurora's vision went slightly white at the edges. I want to speak to her, she said. That's not... I want to speak to my mother right now, or I hang up this phone and you can explain to whoever sent you why the leverage walked away. Another pause, longer this time. Then a shuffle, and the particular sound of a phone being transferred. Rory, her mother's voice, thin, slightly slurred from medication, but present, aware. Baby, don't you do anything stupid. Are you hurt? I'm fine. I'm annoyed. A breath. Don't you dare give these men what they want. I mean it. Mom, I raised you better than that. The phone was taken back. Satisfied? The man said. Put me back to Lucien. Lucien Moretti isn't part of this negotiation. Everything is part of his negotiation, Aurora said. You made it that way when you took her from his house. Call him, tell him your terms. Or don't, and explain to whoever hired you why you're still holding an old woman instead of getting paid. She ended the call. Her hands were shaking when she put the phone down on the table. She pressed them flat against the wood and breathed through it, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way her mother had taught her when she was 8 and afraid of thunderstorms. Then she called Lucien. He came back in 90 minutes, not 2 hours, with the name of the location and an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something stripped down and clean and very cold. The face of a man who had made a decision and arrived at peace with it in the way that people sometimes do when the decision is the kind you don't walk back from. He sat across from her at the table and she told him about the call, word for word, because she had a precise memory under pressure and she knew he'd need every word. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Ryan, he said. She felt it land before she understood it. What? The voice, the phrasing, I think shows a level of care you ought to appreciate. That's not how a hired operative speaks. That's personal. Someone who has been nursing a specific resentment for a specific amount of time. He looked at her. And someone who knows that your mother's equipment is medical grade, who knew which equipment to transfer, which medication she takes. Information a stranger wouldn't have. The air in the room went cold. He was my fiancé for 2 years, Aurora said. Yes. He held her hand in the hospital. Yes. She sat with it. The shape of it was so ugly she had to turn it carefully to see the whole surface. Ryan, who had sat in waiting rooms with her. Ryan, who knew her mother's medication schedule because Aurora had texted it to him 100 times, running late from the pharmacy, asking him to check. Ryan, who had known about Finch for 4 months and said nothing. Ryan, who had taken money from her father and smiled at her across church pews and told her he loved her in the parking lot of the Billings Medical Center while a doctor was still inside telling her mother that the timeline had shortened. She stood up very suddenly, walked to the window and stood with her back to Lucien and her forehead resting against the cold glass. I defended him, she said. To you. I said he was the man I'd loved since childhood. You weren't wrong to have loved him. You were deceived. I was stupid. No. His voice was even. You trusted someone you'd known for 20 years. That's not stupidity. That's what people are supposed to do with 20 years. She turned around. Don't make this easier for me to carry. I don't want it easier right now. He held her gaze. Okay. She wiped her face, dry as it turned out, which surprised her, and straightened up. Tell me what you know about where they're holding her. He spread a physical map on the table. Old farmhouse, 12 miles out, a property that had passed through 3 different holding companies in 5 years, the kind of paper trail that was meant to be slow to follow. 2 entry points. Minimal staff, by his count. The operation had moved fast, which meant it was small, which meant Ryan hadn't expected to need to hold anyone for long. He expected me to comply immediately, Aurora said, looking at the map. Yes. He still thinks I'm the woman who called him from hospital waiting rooms. Lucian looked at her. I want to go, she said. Aurora, she is my mother. This is my fault, not because I did something wrong, but because I am the reason she's there. And I am not going to sit in this house while someone else brings her home. She put both hands flat on the map. I'm not asking for a weapon. I'm not asking to breach anything. I want to be there when she comes out. That's all. He studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him running it, calculating, weighing, the way he calculated everything. You stay in the vehicle, he said, unless I tell you otherwise. Agreed. And you do not contact Ryan directly. Whatever you want to say to him, you say it when I've finished what needs to happen first. Her jaw tightened. Fine. Aurora. He waited until she looked at him. I need you to mean that, not agree to it and then do something else because the feeling takes over. I need you to mean it. She looked at him steadily. I mean it. They left at midnight. 6 vehicles. She counted the men loading without wanting to. It was an old habit, inventory under pressure, and got to 31 before Lucian's hand appeared at the door of the car she was in, holding it open, and she got in and stopped counting. The drive was 20 minutes of bad road, the kind that only existed because someone needed a property accessible but inconvenient to stumble upon. The farmhouse sat in a shallow depression, visible from the ridge above as a collection of lit windows in a darkness that had no other lights for miles. Her mother was in one of those windows, and the thought of it made something in Aurora's chest feel like it was being slowly tightened by hand. She watched through the windshield as Lucian's people moved. She didn't have words for how efficient it was. Not violent, not yet. Just the systematic closing of options, vehicles positioned. The building bracketed in a way that made the geometry of exit very simple. Lucian walked out into the cold without a jacket, which she'd noticed he never seemed to notice the cold, and she watched him approach the front door and knock on it like a man returning to his own house. The next 4 minutes she could not see fully. She heard 2 shots. Not many, not a sustained exchange, just 2, the sound smaller and flatter than movies prepared you for, and then nothing. Then voices, low and controlled. Then the front door opened and Marcus appeared in the rectangle of light, and he looked toward the vehicle where Aurora was sitting and nodded once. She was out of the car before she'd decided to be. Her mother was in a back room, sitting upright in a reclining chair someone had dragged in, still connected to her portable monitor, with the particular expression of a woman who had decided some time ago to be furious and was maintaining it through sheer will. There was a blanket around her shoulders. There was color in her face. Took you long enough, Margaret Hale said. Aurora crossed the room and put her arms around her mother as carefully as she could, her face pressed into the thin shoulder, and for a long moment she just held on without speaking because there was nothing to say that wouldn't come out wrong. Her mother's arms came up and held her back. I'm all right, Margaret said into her hair. I'm all right, baby. Stop shaking. I'm not shaking. You've been shaking since you were 4 years old whenever you're scared and just don't want to say so. Aurora laughed, which came out wrong, too close to something else, and held on for another few seconds before she made herself stand up and look around the room. Ryan was on the far side of the house. She heard his voice before she saw him, that specific cadence, the one she could have identified from 100 feet in a crowd after 2 years, currently doing the thing it always did under pressure, which was become very careful and very reasonable and very focused on explaining. She found Lucian in the doorway of that room and looked past him. Ryan was sitting in a chair. He wasn't restrained. He was holding himself very still with the practiced calm of a man who had decided that cooperation was his best option, and he looked up when Aurora appeared in the doorway, and his expression did the complicated thing it always did. The part of it that was real, and the part of it that was management, and she could see both now, clearly, in a way she couldn't before because before she'd only ever been looking for the real part. "Aurora," he said. "I can explain." "Don't," she said. "Just let me—" "Ryan," her voice came out completely flat. "My mother has cardiac failure. She is 71 years old. You put her in a room and told a stranger to control her equipment. I wasn't going to hurt her. You already hurt her. The stress alone—" She stopped, made herself breathe. "I want to know one thing, and I want the true answer, not the version you've been working on since they brought you in here." She looked at him directly. "Was any of it real? Any of the 2 years? Was there a moment, one moment, where it was actually what you said it was?" He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was harder to read than she'd expected, which surprised her. He said nothing, which was, in the end, its own answer. She nodded. She turned to leave. "Aurora." His voice came out different, not careful, not managed. Raw, the way voices get when the version someone has been performing finally runs out of material. "I was 17 when your father first offered me money to stay close to you. Did you know that? 17. He didn't want you running off somewhere. He wanted you anchored to the county." A short, ugly sound that might have been a laugh. "By the time I was old enough to make different choices, I'd already built the whole thing on a lie, and I didn't know how to unwind it." She stood with her back to him. "That's not a defense," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She walked out. She stood in the narrow hall of the farmhouse with its peeling wallpaper and its bare bulb overhead and its smell of old wood and damp, and she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds to let the thing that had just been confirmed settle into its actual shape, take up its actual space. Her father had started this when she was a child, not Lucien, not Ryan. Her father, who had stood on a porch with his hat in his hand and smiled at a man who'd been placed in his daughter's life like a piece on a board, had been moving pieces before she was old enough to know the game existed. 10 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and went back to her mother's room and started disconnecting the portable monitor from the room's outlets because they were going home and she was not leaving that to someone else. Lucien appeared in the doorway. He watched her work for a moment without speaking. "My father," she said, without looking up. "He's been doing this for 20 years. "Yes." "You knew that too." A pause. "I suspected the depth of it. I didn't have confirmation." She secured the last connection and straightened up. She looked at him across her mother's room, across the equipment and the blankets and the careful mess of a life that had been interrupted and was now going to be interrupted again. "I need to know everything," she said. "No more pieces when you decide I'm ready. All of it." He held her gaze. "All of it," he said. "Starting with my father." "Starting with your father." She nodded once. She turned back to her mother. "Can you walk to the car?" "I've been walking since 1953, Margaret Hale said, and started to get up. They made it outside and halfway to the vehicles when the second set of headlights appeared on the ridge above. Not Lucien's, not the configuration of his convoy, wider spacing, more of them. Moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment, for everyone to be outside, for the operation to be complete, for the variables to be consolidated into one place on an open road, with no cover and no exit on 3 sides. Aurora counted 7 vehicles before Lucien's hand closed around her arm, and he said, very quietly, "Stay behind me." She looked at him. "Who is that?" His face had the stripped-down, cold expression again, the one she'd seen back at the estate, but underneath it now was something she'd never seen there before. Something tight and controlled that took her a long moment to identify. It was the expression of a man who knew exactly who was coming and had been hoping until this moment that he was wrong. "That," said Lucien, "is my brother." 7 vehicles on the ridge and none of Lucien's men had moved yet, which told Aurora that the order hadn't been given, which told her that Lucien was still calculating, which told her that for the first time since she'd known him, the calculation wasn't clean. She stayed behind him because she'd said she would, and because her mother was 3 feet to her left, and that mattered more than anything else in the next 60 seconds. The lead vehicle came down off the ridge slowly, deliberately. The way you descend when you want the people watching to have time to count the vehicles behind you, to run the numbers, to understand the arithmetic of the situation before you arrive and make it personal. It stopped 20 feet out. The door opened. Damien Moretti was younger than Lucien by what looked like 5 or 6 years, which made him late 20s or very early 30s. And the resemblance between them was the kind that landed like a small shock. Same jaw, same dark coloring, same quality of stillness. But where Lucien's stillness felt like choice, like a man who moved slowly because he'd decided speed was rarely the answer, Damien's felt like compression, like something wound very tight and waiting for permission. He walked toward them with his hands visible, which Aurora recognized as a specific kind of statement. "Brother?" Damien said. Lucien said nothing. Damien's eyes moved to Aurora. They stayed there for a moment with a clinical interest that made her skin tighten. "She's smaller than I expected," Damien said, "for someone worth all this." "Say what you came to say," Lucien said. Damien looked back at him. "You've been sloppy. You know that. Coming out here personally, bringing her out here." He gestured loosely at the farmhouse, the vehicles, the whole assembled situation. "You used to never do this. You used to send men." "I send men when I trust the outcome to men. What do you want, Damien?" "What I've always wanted." He said it simply, without heat, like it was a fact of geography. "Everything you built, which, to be fair, I helped build, which you have seemed to forget since you started spending your time in Montana." One of Lucien's men shifted, just slightly, a weight transfer, the preparatory kind. Damien's eyes went to him immediately, sharp and fast, and the man went still. "You can't do the math," Damien said, speaking to Lucy, but watching the man. "On your best day, right now, you have 31 people on this road. I have 64. Some of yours are managing vehicles, managing the old woman, managing—" His eyes came back to Aurora. "Other priorities. Mine are undivided." He spread his hands. "So let's have a real conversation." Aurora felt her mother's hand find her arm in the dark. Margaret's grip was light, but there, anchoring. "The terms," Lucien said. "Simple. You step back, formally, in writing, with the council as witness. You retain income from 3 properties. I'm not unreasonable. I know you have expenses. And you take your Montana situation and you go live quietly somewhere. The organization continues. Under me." He paused. "And the woman goes free, completely. Her mother, her people, no further interest." "You had her mother taken tonight," Lucien said. "I applied pressure. That's different from intent." Damien's expression didn't change. "I want you gone, Lucien. I don't care about a farmer's daughter from Culver Creek." The word farmer moved through Aurora like a current she didn't show. Lucien stood in the cold and looked at his brother for a long moment. The kind of look that had a lot of history in it. 20 years of shared blood and shared work, and whatever the specific texture of this particular resentment had been, accumulating quietly underneath. "And if I don't agree," Lucien said, "then we handle it here." Damien said it with something that was almost regret. "And it's messier. For everyone. Especially for the people who can't defend themselves." His eyes moved to Margaret, just for a second. But the message was complete and everyone on that road received it. Aurora felt something move through her chest that was not fear. It was colder than fear and more specific, and she recognized it from the moment she'd stood in her kitchen holding a phone bill she couldn't pay, looking at a number that didn't feel real. The moment when you realize that the situation has stopped being something that can be navigated with good faith and has become something that requires a different set of tools entirely. She took one step forward. Lucien's arm came out, not grabbing, just there, a barrier. "I'm not going to do anything," she said quietly. To him, not to Damien. "I just want to stand next to you." A beat. He lowered his arm. She moved up beside him and looked at Damien Moretti directly for the first time and said, "He's not stepping back." Damien looked at her with the polite interest of someone watching an animal behave unexpectedly. "I'm sorry," he said. "You heard me. This isn't your negotiation." You made it mine when you took my mother out of a bed where she was recovering from heart failure, Aurora said. So yes, it is mine now. She held his gaze. And the answer is no. He's not stepping back. He's not signing anything. And we're not going to stand here and let you do the math at us. Damien looked at Lucian. You let her speak for you now. She's speaking for herself, Lucian said. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he made a small sound, not quite a laugh, and reached into his jacket. Every one of Lucien's men moved at once. The sound of it was immediate and specific. The hard mechanical sounds of weapons coming up, the shuffle of positioning, 31 people making themselves into something with a shape. Damien stopped with his hand inside his jacket and smiled with his teeth and said, very carefully, "Phone." He withdrew a phone, held it up. The screen showed a live feed, a small room, gray walls, 2 men visible, and between them a piece of equipment that Aurora recognized because she'd spent 4 years learning to recognize it. Her mother's cardiac monitor, not the one they'd transferred from the estate. A different one. And the 2 men on the screen were standing close to the power source. Remote location, Damien said pleasantly. Different from the farmhouse. My people were there before you arrived tonight. He tilted the phone so Lucian could see. The equipment runs on a battery backup, which lasts approximately 40 minutes. After that, it draws from the local supply, which my people control. He looked at his watch. You've been here for 26 minutes. The arithmetic of that settled over the road like weather. 14 minutes. Aurora's jaw tightened until she could feel it in her back teeth. So here's how this works, Damien said, putting the phone back in his jacket. You agree, here, now, in front of your people. Verbal agreement, formal paperwork follows, and I make one call and that room stays powered indefinitely. Or, he let the sentence end itself. Lucien's breathing hadn't changed. Aurora could see his chest from the side. Steady, measured, the breathing of a man who had been in rooms where the options were all bad and had learned to think inside that constraint. You won't let her die, Lucian said. Killing a civilian, an old woman, ends relationships you still need. The council won't protect you from that. You're right that I'd prefer not to, Damien said, but I've done the cost analysis, Lucien, and the math says that a messy solution right now is cheaper than letting you rebuild for the next 2 years and come back at me from a position of strength. So yes, I'd prefer not to. I will if I have to. 12 minutes, approximately. Aurora turned her head and looked at her mother. Margaret Hale was standing in the cold with a blanket around her shoulders and her portable monitor in Vera's hands, and she was watching Aurora with the same expression she'd had from across every hard room they'd been in together, clear-eyed, calm in the way that cost something. Margaret shook her head, very slightly. No. Don't you give him what he wants. Aurora turned back. She looked at Lucien's profile in the dark and thought, clearly and without panic, about the geometry of the situation. 64 men on one side, 31 on the other, a timer running, a brother who had done the cost analysis, a road with 3 closed exits. There was one thing Damien hadn't calculated. She stepped fully in front of Lucien. Stop, Lucian said, low and immediate. You said I could stand next to you. That's not... Damien. She addressed him directly, cutting off whatever Lucien was about to say. You want the organization. You want Lucien gone. You don't want the civilian variable. You said so yourself. She kept her voice level. So here's a different math. I leave. Tonight. Voluntarily, on my own, no coercion. Lucien's leverage disappears. Whatever argument you're making to the council about his instability, his distraction, his prioritizing a Montana situation over the business, it vanishes. He becomes what he was before I existed, which is someone you can't build a case against. The road was very quiet. Aurora, Lucian said. His voice had dropped to something she'd never heard from him before. I'm not asking your permission, she said, without turning around. Damien studied her. You'd walk away. I'd walk away. From him, from the protection, from everything he's set up. Yes. Damien was quiet for a moment, then, and I'm supposed to believe that. You don't have to believe it. You have 64 men. If I walk to one of your vehicles and get in, you have your answer. And if you're buying time, for what? She spread her hands, the same gesture he'd used earlier, and she watched him register it. Your count is right. His people are divided. There's no cavalry coming. I'm not buying time. She looked at him steadily. I'm offering you a clean solution. 8 minutes. Damien looked past her to Lucy. Whatever passed between the two brothers in that look took about 3 seconds and contained things she couldn't read. Then Damien looked back at her. Walk to the second vehicle, he said. She turned around. Lucienne was looking at her with the expression that she had, in the past 3 weeks, seen approximately twice. Both times when something happened that he hadn't calculated, hadn't seen coming, and was processing with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. No, he said, quiet and absolute. It's my choice. Aurora? My mother. My choice. She held his gaze. Make the call to power the equipment. Right now. Tell Damien to make the call. His jaw was a hard line. He was doing the calculation. She could see it, could see the pieces moving behind his eyes. And she watched him reach the point where every outcome he could find had something wrong with it, and the only remaining option was the one she was handing him, which he didn't want. I will come back, she said, for my mother. Once she's stable, once this is resolved, there's no resolution where you disappear with my brother, Lucienne said. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand. I don't think you do. Lucienne. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it in the last 2 weeks. Straight, no softening. Make the call. 6 minutes. Damien spoke. I'm going to need a decision. Lucien looked at his brother over Aurora's head. Something happened in his face that she felt more than saw. Something giving way, an internal structure she'd spent weeks learning to read, shifting under load in a way it hadn't before. Make your call, Lucien said to Damien. Power the equipment. Damien's hand went to his phone. He made a brief call, said 3 words, ended it. He looked at the live feed, nodded once, and held the screen out briefly so Lucien's people could see the men in the room step back from the power source. 4 minutes to spare, Damien said pleasantly. Aurora started walking toward the second vehicle. She made it 6 steps before Lucien's hand caught her wrist. Not hard. Not the grip from the mountain road. Not restraint. Just contact. She stopped but didn't turn. Don't, he said. Just the one word. She felt it in the back of her throat. She turned her head enough to see his profile. The cut on his jaw from the mountain road 2 hours ago had closed but was still visible. He was looking forward, not at her, and his hand on her wrist was the kind of grip that a person uses when they've decided they're not going to hold on, but they need 1 more second. I'll find you, he said. She didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to say to that. It was both a promise and a fact, and she believed it completely, which was its own complicated thing. She walked to the second vehicle. The door opened from inside. She got in. The door closed. Through the window, she could see Lucien standing on the road. His arm had dropped to his side. He was watching the vehicle with the expression of a man who has done something that cost him everything and finished the transaction because it was the right thing and now was standing in the aftermath of it, which is always the hardest part. The vehicle began to move. Aurora kept her eyes on him through the glass until the road bent and the dark took him. They drove for 40 minutes before the vehicle stopped. She had spent the time cataloging, not from calm, from necessity, from the part of her brain that went cold and operational under pressure, and was the same part that had helped a bleeding stranger on a train and assembled a plan in 6 seconds on a farmhouse porch and looked a man with 64 men behind him directly in the eye and offered him a cleaner math. The location was a warehouse on the western edge of something industrial. She'd tracked the turns as best she could and placed herself somewhere in the corridor between Billings and Laurel, which meant she wasn't completely off the map. The building was not abandoned. It had been set up. Lights, generators, the particular smell of a space that people had been working in for several days. Prepared. This had been planned for longer than tonight. She got out of the vehicle without being told to. A man she hadn't seen before led her inside through a main corridor with concrete floors and the kind of industrial lighting that made everyone look like they were already underwater, and into a room off to the right. The room was not a cell. That was the first thing she noticed. It was the second thing after noticing that Damien was already there. He must have taken a different vehicle, faster route, or she'd been driven slowly on purpose. He was sitting on a work table, jacket off now, looking at his phone with the relaxed posture of someone who was pleased with how the evening had gone. "Sit down," he said. She sat, not because he told her to, because she needed to think, and thinking was easier horizontal pressure on her feet. "You surprised me," Damien said. "I'll give you that." "I wasn't trying to." That's what made it surprising. He put the phone down and looked at her properly. "You actually love him." "We've known each other 3 weeks." That wasn't a question. He tilted his head slightly. "I've been watching Lucien for a long time, since we were children. I know what he looks like when something matters to him, and what he looks like when he's managing something. Tonight, on that road," he paused, "I've never seen him look like that." "Is this relevant?" Aurora said. "It's context." He slid off the table and stood. "Here's the situation. You're going to stay here for approximately 48 hours while my people complete what needs to be completed on the organizational side. The council meets the day after tomorrow. Once the formal succession is documented, you go home. Everything I told Lucien Stan, you're free, your mother is free, no further interest." She looked at him steadily. "You're telling me all of this?" "Yes. Because you're confident I can't do anything with it. Because you're not a problem, Miss Hale. You were leverage. Leverage has a purpose, and then it's done." He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if there'd been cruelty. "Try to sleep. There's a cot in here, blankets. Someone will bring food." He walked to the door. "He'll come here," she said. Damien stopped with his hand on the doorframe. "I know. Before the council meets." "I know that too." He didn't turn around. "I have 64 people, and I know exactly where every piece of Lucien's operation is right now. I've been planning this for 16 months. He looked back at her over his shoulder. "He'll come. He'll lose. And then it'll be done, and you can both go live quietly somewhere, which is all I ever actually wanted from either of you." He left. The door didn't lock. She checked, because of course she checked. But there were 2 men outside it, and the corridor beyond had a third. And the exits she'd mentally mapped on the way in were both monitored. She sat on the cot and put her face in her hands and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something she wouldn't name. Then she started thinking about what 48 hours actually meant. Lucien was going to come. Damien was right about that. He hadn't needed to say it, hadn't said it to her specifically, but she'd known it from the road, from the look on Lucien's face when the car started moving, from the way he'd said, "I'll find you," like it was a simple logistical fact. He was going to come with what he had, which was 31 people against 64 on ground that Damien had chosen and prepared. And the math of that was the same math it had been on the road, and it still didn't work. Unless something changed. She lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about what could change. Not hoped, thought. Methodically, the way her mother had taught her to think about problems when she was 12 and they were behind on the farm mortgage, and Margaret had sat her down and said, "Okay, Rory, take everything you're feeling and put it in a box on a shelf. You can take it down later. Right now we're going to think." She was still thinking when she heard, 3 hours later and much closer than should have been possible, the first sound of breaking glass. She sat up. Not an accident, deliberate. The specific sharp sound of someone creating an entry point in a structured way, which meant Lucien had found her faster than Damien had calculated. And that meant something in Damien's intelligence had been wrong, or something in Lucien's capabilities had been underestimated, or someone on Damien's side had made a different choice in the last 3 hours. Outside her door, the 2 men moved. Fast. Aurora stood up. She looked around the room with the specific focus of someone who needs a tool and has exactly as long as the next 30 seconds to find one. The cot frame was bolted. The work table was metal, too heavy. There was a fire extinguisher bracket on the wall, empty. The extinguisher itself was gone, which told her someone had thought about this room specifically. There was a length of heavy electrical conduit on the floor near the back wall, left over from whatever work had last been done in here, about 2 feet long and solid. She picked it up. The sounds outside got louder, and then suddenly more complex. Not just breaking glass, but the specific overlapping percussion of a building where multiple things were happening at once. Shouting, movement, the flat, hard sounds she'd heard once before on a mountain road. Closer now, more of them. Her door opened. Not Damien, not one of the guards. A man she'd never seen before. One of Lucien's people. She could tell by the way he said her name immediately, before he'd fully entered the room, the way someone does when they're expected to retrieve something specific and need to confirm it fast. "Miss Hale, we need to move right now." She held the conduit and didn't move. "Where's Lucien?" "East corridor. We need to go." "Where is he?" The man looked at her for a half-second with the expression of someone who had been told about her and is confirming what they were told. "Building's east end. He's managing the main position. I'm supposed to get you out first. Take me to him." "Ma'am? Take me to him, or I find him myself. And given that I don't know this building, I'll probably walk into something worse. Either way." She held his gaze. "Your choice." He made it in about 2 seconds. "Stay behind me. Don't stop for anything." They moved. The corridor was a different world from 20 minutes ago. The industrial calm entirely gone, replaced by the specific chaos of a building where a coordinated breach was in progress, where the number of things happening simultaneously was designed to prevent a coherent response. She ran and kept her eyes forward and held the conduit and felt her own heartbeat in her ears, her feet on the concrete floors, the cold air coming through somewhere a window used to be. They went through 2 doors, down a half-flight of stairs, and into a larger space. The main floor of the warehouse, which had been set up as a kind of operations hub, work tables and equipment cases, and now upturned. 3 of Damien's men down, one of Lucien's crouched behind an overturned table. She saw Lucien at the far end of the floor. He had a cut above the same eyebrow as on the train, this one fresh and bleeding freely, and he was holding his left arm at an angle that said something in it had been recently hit, and he was watching the doorway opposite him with the absolute still focus of a man who is measuring something precisely. Then Damien walked through that doorway. He didn't have a weapon visible. He came through with his hands at his sides, and he looked across the floor and found his brother and stopped. The warehouse went quiet. Not completely. There was still sound from other parts of the building, distant and muffled. But the main floor went still the way spaces go still. When the 2 people who are actually the center of everything finally occupy the same room, and everything else understands this and waits. "You got here faster than I expected," Damien said. "You underestimated some things," Lucien said. "Evidently." Damien looked across the floor and found Aurora, and whatever he felt about finding her there instead of in the room he'd left her in, he absorbed without showing it. "Still think the math works?" "The math changed," Lucien said. Damien nodded slowly. "Because she's here. Because you would always come for her. Which means—" He stopped, and for the first time all night, something moved through his expression that wasn't calculation. "You'd trade the throne for her. You actually would." "I already did," Lucien said, "on the road." "That was leverage." "No," Lucien said. That was the answer. Damien looked at his brother for a long moment. "I've been building toward this for 16 months, he said. "I have a vote from the council already. I have documentation. I have 2/3 of the senior positions committed." He spread his hands. "The organization is already mine, Lucien. What you'd be fighting for right now is theater." "Then why are you still here?" Lucien said. "If it's already done, if the votes are there and the documentation's filed, why are you in this building having this conversation instead of sitting in a room somewhere watching me fail?" Damien didn't answer. "Because it's not done," Lucien said. "Because the council will wait on Ferrara's vote, and Ferrara won't move until he sees how this ends. And Ferrara has known me for 22 years and known you for 8, and the shape of what happens tonight is the thing he's watching." He took a step forward. "Which means you need this to go a specific way. You need me to step back, in person, on record. And you don't have that yet." Damien's expression had gone very still. "So here we are," Lucien said, "and I'm not stepping back. Damien reached behind him and came back with something that was not a phone, and Aurora raised the conduit in her hands before she'd decided to. And across the floor, Lucien moved toward his brother, and the warehouse became a place where the last pieces of a 16-month plan and a 20-year relationship arrived simultaneously at their ending point, which was this cold floor, these two men. And the thing about a knife fight in a warehouse is that it sounds nothing like what you'd expect. There's no ring of metal, no cinematic clang. What it sounds like is breath, the hard, working breath of two people moving fast in a cold space, punctuated by the short, ugly sounds of impact and the scrape of boots on concrete, and sometimes a sound that's worse than either of those, the sound of something connecting with a body and the body absorbing it. Lucien and Damien had been in the same room for 4 minutes, and the floor between them already looked like a record of where the conversation had been. Aurora stood 10 feet back with the conduit still in her hands and watched her peripheral vision, because the man Lucien had sent for her was managing the doorway, and there were still variables in this building that hadn't resolved, and she had understood in the last 3 weeks that the space around a fight mattered as much as the fight itself. Damien was good. That was the first clear thing she understood. She had expected, from the way Lucien spoke about him, something manageable, a younger brother who had ambition exceeding his skill, whose plan had been the sophisticated part. What she saw instead was someone who had been trained by the same people who had trained Lucien, who had 22 years of watching his brother and had used the time to learn where the angles were. He'd already opened Lucien's left arm, not deep, but real, blood showing through the torn sleeve now, and the way Lucien was holding it said something in the shoulder had taken a hit earlier, before she'd arrived, that he'd been managing without showing. He was managing more than he was showing. She understood that about him now. He'd been managing things without showing them since a train out of Billings, and the knowledge of it sat in her chest like something she'd owned for years. Damien came forward low and fast with the knife, and Lucien moved offline and caught his brother's wrist, and the two of them went into the work table behind them with a sound that echoed off the ceiling. Equipment cases hit the floor. The knife skittered sideways and came to rest near Aurora's feet. She looked at it. She left it where it was and kept watching. Damien got an elbow into Lucien's ribs. Once, twice, the specific deliberate pressure of someone who knows where a previous injury is and is working it. Lucien's breath came out in a sound she felt more than heard, and he dropped one knee to the floor, and Damien stepped back and straightened up with the loose-limbed readiness of someone who has just made space to finish something. "Stay down," Damien said. He wasn't winded. His voice was the same it had been on the road. "I'm telling you, as your brother, stay down." Lucien got up. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. He put one hand on the work table and pushed himself to standing with the specific deliberateness of someone overriding a body that has opinions about this decision. And when he was upright, he was breathing through his mouth, and there was blood on his chin from the arm and a new source she couldn't identify. And he looked at his brother with an expression that had shed everything except the essential. "You were always better at the math," Lucien said. "Yes," Damien said. "You planned better. You were more patient. You built the council case correctly." Lucien wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his hand. "You did everything right." "Then why?" "Because you did it to me," Lucien said. It came out very quiet. Not to an obstacle, not to a position, to me. Damien's face changed. The first time all night, it changed all the way. The calculation dropping off and leaving something younger and rawer underneath it. The face of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had almost forgotten what it felt like before they picked it up. "You left first," Damien said. "I know. You built all of it, and then you started stepping away, and I watched you hand pieces of it to people who hadn't built anything, and I had—" He stopped. "I had given 20 years. "I know," Lucien said. "You didn't ask me. You just started dismantling it." "I know." The two words, repeated, with the same weight each time. Not defense, not negotiation. Something older and harder. "I should have talked to you," Lucien said. "Before. About what I was doing, why I was stepping back. I didn't. That's on me." "Don't." Damien's voice went rough. "Don't do that. Don't stand there bleeding and give me the reasonable version. I came here with 64 people. I had her mother taken. Don't stand there and— I know what you did. I'm not forgiving it. Lucian looked at his brother. I'm telling you it didn't come from nothing, and I should have seen it coming, and I didn't, because I stopped paying attention to what mattered. That's the truth. The warehouse was very still. Aurora felt the conduit in her hands and made herself stay where she was, because this was not her moment, and she understood enough about both of them now to know that. Damien looked at his brother for a long time. I have the council votes, he said, but the edge was different now. Ferrara hasn't moved, Lucian said. A long beat. No, Damien said quietly. He hasn't. Then it's not done. Damien looked at the floor. He put one hand on the back of his neck and stood there in the posture of a man who has driven toward something for 16 months and has arrived at the moment where arriving and winning turn out to be different things. What happens now? He said. You put down whatever you're holding, Lucian. And we talk. Not here, not tonight, but we talk. About what? About what I should have asked you before I started walking away from things we built together. Damien stood there. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not what I planned for. I know, Lucian said. It's what I'm offering. The silence in the warehouse had a specific texture, not peaceful, not resolved, but something that might become one of those things with enough time and enough honesty and probably a great deal of difficulty. Aurora had stood in enough rooms between people who were trying to decide whether to keep destroying each other or to try something harder to know what this silence meant. Damien looked across the floor at her. She did that on purpose, he said. On the road, the offer to leave. Yes, Lucian said. She bought you time to reposition. She also meant it, Lucien said. Both things were true. Damien looked at Aurora for another moment with an expression she couldn't name. Then he set down what he was holding, a short blade, partially extended, that she hadn't seen him draw during the conversation, and set it on the floor and stepped back from it. 3 of his men, who had been in the doorway, looked at each other and made the collective decision of people whose principal has just made a choice that changes the shape of the evening. Lucien exhaled through his nose. It was the most human sound she'd heard from him all night. The next 4 hours were the kind of time that doesn't feel like regular time. Compressed and enormous simultaneously, the specific texture of aftermath when the adrenaline is metabolizing, and what's left is the real accounting. Lucien's shoulder needed attention that went beyond what could be managed in a warehouse. Aurora found out about the shoulder and the 2 broken ribs from earlier in the evening when she was helping Vera assess him in the back of one of the vehicles, and he stopped her hand moving over his left side with the particular expression of a person trying to manage the reaction to something painful and not entirely succeeding. How long have you been carrying those? She asked. Since about an hour before we got to you, he said. Damien? Door frame. Earlier. She pressed gently, felt him tighten. You fought your brother for 40 minutes with 2 broken ribs. 3 broken ribs. She sat back. And you didn't say anything. There wasn't a useful moment to bring it up. She looked at him for a long moment. In the vehicle light, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been in a building where things went wrong and had come out the other side of it, bleeding and broken and present. You're the most stubborn person I have ever met, she said. I've been told. I mean that as a very specific criticism. I know. Something moved in his face. Thank you. For the road. Don't. Aurora. Don't thank me for it like it was a strategy. I meant what I said to Damien. I would have gone. She held his gaze. I would have walked away and let it be over and gone somewhere with my mother and found a way to live with it. Don't make it smaller than it was by thanking me for the tactical value. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then what do I do with it? Nothing, she said. Just know it. He was quiet. Then, I know it. She went back to assessing the ribs. Margaret Hale was returned to the estate by the time they arrived, transferred back to her room and hooked to her own equipment, and apparently in the process of giving Sandra, who had recovered from the sedative and was furious about it in a quiet, professional way, a detailed account of everything that had happened in the farmhouse, which Sandra was transcribing for some purpose Margaret hadn't fully explained. Aurora walked into her mother's room and sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing for a while. Margaret looked at her daughter's face. The dried mud, the bruised hand, the particular quality of someone who has been running on fear for 6 hours and has now been allowed to stop. Margaret opened her arms. Aurora put her head on her mother's shoulder and stayed there while Margaret's hand moved in her hair, the way it had since she was 4 years old. And outside the estate, the Montana sky was doing what it did in December, which was going from black to a very dark blue without any particular warmth to it. "The man with the broken ribs," Margaret said eventually. "He's downstairs. Vera has him?" "Vera and a doctor she called 40 minutes ago." "Good." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You love him." Aurora didn't answer immediately. "I don't know what name to put on it," she said. 3 weeks isn't... Time isn't the measurement," her mother said. "You know what the measurement is." She did. She'd known it on the mountain road in the rain, and she'd known it in the warehouse, and she'd known it for days before both of those moments in the smaller, quieter ways. The way she'd started reading his silences like a language, the way the estate had stopped feeling like a cage sometime between the first and second week, the way her chest had done something specific and violent when his arm came out bleeding in that warehouse. "He's not an easy life," Aurora said. "No," her mother said. "He's not." A pause. "Neither are you, baby. You never were." Aurora laughed, which came out real this time. The accounting that followed the warehouse took 3 weeks and involved things Aurora only understood partially. Council communications, documentation, a conversation between Lucien and Damien that happened in Lucien's office with the door closed for 2.5 hours, and that neither of them discussed with her in detail, though she could read the shape of it in both their faces afterward. Damien left the estate on the 4th day. He looked older than he had on the road, and when he passed Aurora in the entrance hall, he stopped for a moment like he was going to say something and then didn't, which she understood. What she did understand from Lucienne over several evenings of the incremental truth-telling she'd demanded on the mountain road was that Ferrara had called the morning after the warehouse, that the council had accepted a restructured arrangement, not a succession, not a coup, but something more complicated and probably more fragile that involved Damien taking formal authority over specific territories in exchange for a full cessation of the challenge. That it wasn't peace exactly. That peace was probably not a word that applied cleanly to any of this, but it was stable. For now. "For now is all anything is," Lucien said one evening. They were in the kitchen because the kitchen was where they ended up in the late evenings. Not by plan, but by the accumulation of evenings that had settled into shape. He was drinking coffee he didn't need at 10:30 at night, and she was sitting on the counter the way she'd sat on counters her whole life, and this too had become a thing that had settled into shape without being decided. "Is that a comfort to you?" she asked. "For now. It used to not be. I used to want the permanent version of everything. What changed?" He looked at her over the coffee cup. "Nothing permanent turned out to be what I thought it would be." She held his gaze. "That's not an answer." "You changed it," he said simply. No drama in it, just the fact. She looked at the counter. "I'm not a solution to your life, Lucy. And I know that. I have a sick mother, and a farm that's been let go, and a father I haven't spoken to, and a former fiancé who's going to need to be dealt with in some legal sense eventually. And I've never once in my life known what to do with someone who just..." She stopped. "Who just what?" "Who just keeps showing up," she said, "without it being a transaction, without there being a number attached to it." Lucien set the coffee down. "Your father," he said, "he's been arrested. Fraud and extortion charges along with Ryan. The evidence was submitted to the county 3 days ago." She'd known it was coming. She'd known since the farmhouse, but the word arrested sat differently than she'd expected. Not satisfying, not devastating, just heavy. The specific weight of something that had been wrong for a long time finally becoming officially wrong in a way the world acknowledged. "He's my father," she said. "I know. I don't know what I feel about that." "You don't have to know yet." She looked at him. You keep saying that. You don't have to know yet, because it keeps being true. She slid off the counter. She stood in the kitchen of a house that had stopped feeling like someone else's house somewhere in the last 4 weeks, and looked at a man who had bled for her 3 separate times and had never once asked her to be grateful for it, which was the specific thing she'd never been able to explain to anyone, why that mattered more than everything else. "I'm not going back to the farm," she said. He went very still. "I'm not staying because of the protection, or because my mother is comfortable here, or because it's practical," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know." "Do you?" "Yes," he said. "You've been clear about the difference between things you do because you have to and things you choose. Since the train." She stood there in the kitchen in December with the Montana dark outside the windows and the particular quiet of a house where everyone had finally, after weeks of noise and motion and danger, gone to sleep. "What was it like?" she said. "Billings? The bus station. You were, what, 17? He was quiet for a moment. 16. "What were you doing there?" "Running an errand for my father. The kind of errand a 16-year-old shouldn't run." He looked at the counter. "I was coming back through the station and I heard a child making a sound, but not crying. The specific sound of a child trying not to make any sound at all." She listened. "He had your wrist," Lucian said. "You were looking at the exit and calculating whether you could get there, which is not what most 7-year-olds do. Most 7-year-olds freeze." He paused. "I didn't think about it. I just moved." "Did you know who I was?" "No." "When did you find out?" "When your father's name came up in a business context 8 years ago. I ran the family." A beat. "I don't know why I did. Reflex, maybe. You were just a name in a file that connected to a face I hadn't forgotten." She studied him. "You remembered my face. For 9 years. You were looking for the exit," he said. "At 7 years old. I didn't forget that." She stood with it. The long chain of it. 16. Billings. A child at a bus station. A 16-year-old running his father's errand who had moved without thinking, and then 9 years, and then a train, and then a farm in Montana with a convoy of black SUVs coming down the road. The whole shape of it, assembled. "You could have told me," she said. "On the train." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I didn't want it to matter because of that. I wanted whatever happened to happen because of what I did in front of you. Not because of something I'd done when you were 7 that you barely remembered." She was quiet for a long time. Then she walked toward him and stopped about 2 feet away, which was close enough that she could see the healing cut above his eyebrow, and the fading bruise along his jaw, and the way his shoulder sat slightly different on the left side, still compensating. "You're a very complicated person," she said. "Yes." "Your life is genuinely dangerous." "Yes. I've been in danger more times in 4 weeks than in my entire previous life." "Yes." His voice was very even, and he wasn't trying to argue any of it. "And you're still not going to tell me it'll get easier or safer or simpler." "No," he said. "I'm not." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the window, the Montana dark was doing that thing it did in December before snow, going very still, very dense, the air holding something. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the unbruised side gently. He went completely still, like a man who has been waiting a long time to know whether a thing was going to happen and has now stopped waiting. "You won without forcing me," she said quietly. "Do you understand what that means? In my life, what I've come from, what my father is, what Ryan was, nobody has ever—" She stopped, found the words. "Nobody has ever wanted something from me and then just waited to see if I'd offer it." His hand came up and covered hers against his jaw. His grip was careful, the same careful way he'd not held on the mountain road. "I would have waited longer," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why you don't have to." She kissed him. It was not dramatic. It was not the resolution of tension in the way that movies manufactured, scored and lit and arrived at cleanly. It was 2 people in a kitchen at 10:30 at night, both of them tired in the specific way that comes after weeks of surviving things. And the kiss was quiet and real and tasted like coffee and had in it all the things that had been true for weeks without being said. When she pulled back, she kept her hand on his jaw and he kept his hand over hers. My mother's going to have opinions, she said. Your mother has opinions about everything, he said. I respect that about her. She laughed, properly this time, the kind that came from somewhere real. The surgery happened in February. Not in Montana, in a hospital in Denver, where a cardiac surgeon named Dr. Okafor had a wait list that was 18 months long and an opening that appeared because Lucian knew someone who knew someone. And Aurora had made him tell her exactly how it happened and had accepted it with the particular pragmatism of a woman who understood that the world ran on relationships and that the relevant question was what those relationships were used for. She sat in the surgical waiting room for 7 hours. Lucien sat beside her for 6 of them. He left once, for 20 minutes, and came back with food she hadn't asked for and coffee that was actually good, which she drank without commenting on it. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances. He didn't tell her it was going to be fine. He sat there, the way he did everything, with the quality of someone who has decided that presence is the thing and is providing it completely. Vera called twice. Marcus called once about something operational and was told by Lucien in 4 words that it could wait. At hour 7, Dr. Okafor came into the waiting room, still in her surgical cap, and said the words that Aurora had been waiting to hear for 4 years in various forms: successful, stable, recovery, prognosis. And Aurora sat for a moment and breathed through it, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. And then she put her face in her hands and let the 7 hours and the 4 years and everything in between have the 30 seconds they needed. Lucien's hand came to rest on her back, steady and still. She straightened up and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and turned to look at him. She's okay, she said. She's okay, he said. She nodded once. Then she stood up and went to find her mother. Margaret Hale came home in March. Not to the estate, to a smaller house, 40 minutes from it, in a valley that had the particular quality of Montana in early spring, which was tentative and wide open and occasionally still cold enough to make you question everything. The house had a porch and a view and a medical setup that was unobtrusive and thorough and had been assembled by Vera with the attention to detail that Vera applied to everything. Margaret stood on the porch the first afternoon and looked at the valley for a long time. It's a good house, she said. Yes, Aurora said. Whose name is it in? Mine, Aurora said. I made that a condition. Her mother looked at her sideways. Conditions. I'm learning to negotiate. From whom, I wonder? But she was smiling. They sat on the porch until the cold made sitting impractical, and then went inside, and Margaret found the kitchen in the way that mothers find kitchens, immediately, instinctively, assessing the contents with the expression of someone who has plans. That man is coming for dinner, Margaret said. Not a question. Thursday, Aurora said. Tell him to come Tuesday. That gives me 2 days to be on my feet properly. Aurora texted Lucian. He responded in 30 seconds. Tuesday. She stood in the kitchen of her own house and looked at that single word and felt, in the specific quiet way that things settle after a long time of noise, something she recognized as a kind of peace. Not the absence of complication, not the end of risk, but the sense of being on the right road even when the road was difficult. Her phone showed one other notification, a news alert, automated, that she'd set up months ago and mostly ignored. Ryan Castillo, plea agreement, 18 months. Her father, so separate proceedings, outcome pending. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone face down on the counter and went to help her mother with whatever she was planning in the kitchen, because Margaret Hale had survived 71 years and cardiac surgery and a kidnapping and a December in a house full of armed men. And if she said she was cooking Tuesday dinner, she was cooking Tuesday dinner, and Aurora was not going to miss a moment of it. The snow came in December again. The second December. The one that felt different because the first one had been the year everything broke open, and this one was the year of what came after. It started in the early evening, the particular soft accumulation of the first real snow of the season, and by 8 o'clock the valley was white, and the porch light of the small house was making a circle of gold in all that white, and inside, through the window, you could see the shapes of people who had found their way to the same table. Margaret, upright and sharp-eyed, and in the kind of health that Dr. Okafor called remarkable, and that anyone who had met Margaret Hale would have called completely predictable. Vera, who had developed a habit of appearing at Tuesday dinners that had extended to other evenings as well, and who sat at the table like a person who had forgotten she used to consider herself primarily staff. A man named Marcus, who barely spoke but ate a great deal and was teaching Margaret chess, badly, in the sense that Margaret was winning. And Lucien, at the end of the table, listening to something Margaret was saying with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. Aurora stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and watched it. There was nothing resolved exactly about any of it. The world Lucien operated in didn't resolve. It shifted and required navigation, and would continue to. Her father's case was still pending. Damien existed somewhere to the east in an arrangement that was stable and fragile and would require maintenance. The road they were on was the road they were on, and it had the specific texture of a road built by two people who had stopped pretending they were going somewhere simple. But her mother was alive. Her mother was playing chess at a dinner table in her own house in a valley in Montana, and outside it was snowing the way it had snowed every December of Aurora's life, enormous and clean. And at the table the man who had found her on a mountain road and bled for her and told her the truth, even when it was inconvenient, and waited without demanding. That man was laughing at something her mother had said, and the laugh was real, which she'd learned to distinguish from the other kind. Lucien looked up and found her in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just looked, the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't watching, with the full attention, the reading a language you couldn't speak quality. And then he did something she'd seen only a handful of times. He smiled. Not the almost smile. Not the contained thing that moved across his face and was gone. A real one. The kind that reached everything. Aurora stood in the kitchen doorway and felt the full weight of the year settle around her. Not crushing, not lifting, just present. The way the truth is when you finally stop trying to make it into something other than what it is. She went back to the kitchen and finished what she was doing. Outside, the snow kept coming, quiet and indifferent and beautiful, covering the long road in and the long road out in the same white, the way it always had, the way it always would, regardless of what happened on those roads or who had traveled them or what they had carried when they did.